the Impostor Syndrome Files. I am so grateful that you're here, and I really hope that you've been enjoying the conversations that you've been listening to, and hopefully finding some tips, some next steps that you can take if you struggle with similar feelings of self-doubt, which obviously, as you're hearing, are fairly universal. This is something that we all go through from time to time. When I started this podcast, my goal was really to try to normalize the experience, to let everybody know that you are not alone, that there's a name for what you're feeling, and that there are steps that we can be taking to manage it more effectively. What I have found over the course of these conversations has been fascinating. I have had an absolutely powerful and different conversation with every single person who I have interviewed. I worried at one point that there may not be enough to talk about. How much is there to say about imposter syndrome? Are the stories going to start to get repetitive? That has absolutely not been the case. Everyone brings a fascinating new perspective to this conversation. I have learned something from every discussion that we've had. I hope you have too. I want to make a note that many of these recordings are being done during the social distancing that's happening with coronavirus. I am doing my best to protect the sound quality, but we are all in homes that have pets, kids, all kinds of background noise going on. For me, it's much more important to share with you a very natural conversation between two people than it is to share a perfectly polished recording. So I hope that you will bear with us if there are moments where the sound is not perfect. Really, my goal is to share stories, not to provide perfectly scripted, perfectly polished audio. So apologies for any imperfections that may be coming through in the recordings, but I'm hoping that you're getting the essence of the message regardless. So thank you again for being here. I wish you all the best and hope that you will consider sharing your own story one day. Thanks again. Welcome, Tara. I am really excited to have you here today. I would love to start by having you introduce yourself.
Sure. So my name is Tara, and I am from Maine, and I am a professor of physical therapy. I'm an assistant clinical professor, and I work with placing students in their clinical placements.
Great. So let's start with the question I generally ask, which is, what does imposter syndrome mean to you, and how, if at all, has it shown up in your life or in your career?
So, I think that's a great question. So I am the proverbial first generation college student. And so imposter syndrome has sort of shown its face in its way across my career, in that each time I would achieve something or move into a novel position that might be novel to my family or novel to my community, et cetera, it was always a question of, do I really kind of belong here? Or, this seems a little odd. It seemed like the natural progression of what I should be doing over time in terms of changing my position. So for years, I worked as a physical therapist in pediatrics, and I was a mom. And so I have 4 children, and I ran my own practice. I worked in a very rural, poor school district, which was really my intention. I also do some international mission stuff, working with children that are have disabilities and are living in in poverty. And so when I started to do teaching work, I really did it because I myself needed to have a source of education, and I really couldn't afford to get it any other way. So the smartest way for me to get an education was actually to give an education. So I went to work as an adjunct professor in the pediatrics lab at the university that was somewhat local to me. So after that, things sort of just progressed. Every time an opportunity would arise, I would just take it because it was more learning for me.
And you mentioned being a first generation college student. You talked about the journey of taking on new things as they came along. And that is a very classic trigger of imposter syndrome, being the first in your family to do something. And then, of course, starting something new comes with a lot of self-doubt. Can you say more about how it showed up for you?
Sure. I think that I was always anxious to do the learning. It's much more difficult to put myself into the role of being an expert in anything. I feel that feels much more difficult to me. So, being an adjunct professor made a lot of sense. I could use the experience that I had with teaching in pediatrics. I knew that I had background and knowledge in that. When it came time for interviewing to actually take on the role of an assistant professor, that felt like a big jump to me. It was something I wanted to do because a university is a setting where you can consistently do lots of learning. It was like free learning. It seemed like a great opportunity. But I knew going into my interview that my CV was light, or at least I perceived that it was, that I probably had less skill in many in the area of IT. I had been parenting and running a practice, but had not stayed current in lots of places. So I felt like I knew my gaps, and those felt a little bit threatening.
Did you end up getting the job?
I did. Yeah, I got the job, and I went in and had a pretty authentic interview. Like, if you want me, then these are the sort of the things that come with me. And I'm very interested in filling in my own gaps. I'm capable of filling in my own gaps. At the same time as I was doing this interviewing process, I was also enrolled in a doctoral program. And so it gave me a little bit more credibility, but I was just starting the program. So I certainly didn't have all of the doctoral degree kind of expertise under my belt at the time that I took the position.
Well, it's interesting because I'm thinking more generally about what you're saying and wondering how often it happens that we make assumptions about what other people value in a candidate, right? And so you went in with, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but essentially preconceived notions about what was important to them and what they were judging you on as it related to, you mentioned the technology, you mentioned feeling like your CV was a bit light, but clearly that's not how they saw you. So did that change your mindset at all?
So it's interesting that you would ask the question, because there's a varying audience that saw me in different lights. So the hiring bodies at the time, I was fortunate that they were interested in the skill set I did possess versus the skill set I didn't possess. But as I did come to work, there were expectations from colleagues that somebody hired into my position should have a particular skill set. So I had one particular colleague who let me know at one point that, she was surprised that I didn't have this basic knowledge that she would have assumed that everybody would have at this particular level. And it was only one person, so as always, one negative statement needs to be outweighed by like 20 positive statements. So I recall that just sort of solidified for me in my mind. Yeah, I'm not really quite qualified, but I'm so glad to be here. I'm going to do whatever I can do to stay. So yeah, I think that yes, people are looking for different things. And I think that people bring strengths in different areas. And I think the value for what those things are sometimes is surprising to me. Yes.
I love how you also said that you were very authentic in how you presented yourself too, because you could have tried to pretend that you were better than you were at certain things or to try to dodge certain questions, right? But I think that certainly perpetuates that feeling of being an imposter, right? If you feel like you've oversold yourself or misled somebody, did you take comfort in knowing that you were honest up front and they made that decision knowing who you were?
Yeah. That gave me a little more, I felt like a little more room to learn. I felt like I could I believe that my presentation was a little bit odd, because I think many people did bring to the table all of the skills that they do have. And certainly, I don't think that there's a call for being self-depreciating in everything that you do. But I did want to be authentic because if I wasn't authentic, I couldn't then take advantage of seeking out support to help learn where I had gaps. So I needed people to know that because I didn't want to be either embarrassed or shamed. And I feel like those two things probably in my early life more perpetuated that feeling of imposter. The hiding part is what makes it, I think, that much worse.
I love that. And I love that you acknowledge that being upfront about where your gaps lie allowed you to leverage resources to fill them, right? Because I think one of the challenges with imposter syndrome is that there's, like you said, the hiding part is people are afraid to ask for help because they're afraid of exposing themselves. They're afraid that if I ask for help, then people are going to figure out that I don't know what I'm doing, and then something terrible is going to happen, right? So as counterintuitive as it seems, the more effective approach is what you're describing, which is to own where those gaps lie and then to be taking action very deliberately to fill them. That's how your confidence grows, right? You can't deny what you don't know. It is what it is, but how you manage that is where you have an opportunity to work through some of this self-doubt.
Yeah, I think that takes kind of like a mindfulness, to recognize like, these are the places where I really struggle. And I mean, I could tell them to you right now, like I'm terrible with details. I'm, still technology is still one of those things that I feel like I'm constantly learning. And it's been an interesting tool to kind of have that acknowledgement when working with students. I think part of what I remember being a graduate student, and even now, so I'm still in a doctoral program, and when I show up and work with my with the professors that I'm working with, I have to be very careful to not bring with me that shame feeling. Like I feel like I should already know everything they're trying to teach me. And when I don't show up knowing those things, there's moments where I just, I have to fight those instincts of feeling stupid or underinformed or why don't I already know this? It's a lot of self-talk. Like why would you know this? You've never done this before.
So is that what you do? I'm curious, what are the strategies you use?
So I think the strategies that I use are sometimes being a little upfront, even though it feels really bad. Like it really feels very uncomfortable to say to somebody who I perceive to be better than me and an expert in their field, and strongly learned, to say to them, like, I don't really understand what you're saying, or I haven't been exposed to this before, or you're telling me that I need to be a little bit better at scientific writing, and I'm really trying to do that. I know I'm a pretty smart person, but clearly I'm not hearing what you're saying. And it feels uncomfortable each time to say those things. So I think a little bit of what I work with my students on is learning to become comfortable being uncomfortable. And that's exactly how it feels. Super uncomfortable.
What's the general response that you get when you say something like that?
For the most part, in my career and with my colleagues, I usually have a lot, positive affirmation and offers to help me for the most part. With the occasional colleague, you have other personalities that have their own story and their own sense of being threatened or their own history, and those people kind of transiently come and go, and they may make your space a little bit harder, but for the most part, people are not like that. In my doctoral program, there are sometimes calls to me to step it up, and that again doesn't feel great, but it is what I need to do. Doctoral work is challenging work, and it's challenging work when you have 4 children and a full-time position and, other complications that make things difficult. So I try to keep it in the back of my mind that, there are no superhuman people, and I kind of just have to do whatever I can in the moment.
I love that too, that you recognize that there are no superhumans, and that those who react negatively, it's often a reflection on them versus on us, right? You also said something really important when you said sometimes you, and I want to make sure that I'm interpreting this correctly, but that you're advised to step it up. Is that feedback that you were given? Is that your interpretation of feedback that you've been given in certain situations?
Yeah, it actually is feedback that I've been given and I think the term "step it up" is my term. Mm-hmm. So, an example of a realistic statement might be, okay, you did good on this, that, and the other, but we really need to see you perform in this way. Your scientific writing skills need to be a little bit tighter. You need to be able to, you need to be able to summarize more concisely. You need to be able to do X, Y, Z. They will give me some constructive feedback. But even with constructive feedback, that's hard to hear. Like it's hard to hear, because if I think I'm a good communicator, or I think that I'm a decent writer, and I hear that my communication skills aren't what they need to be for this particular project or this particular, level of production, it hurts me. It does. It hurts me. I hate to feel like I'm unprepared.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm sure there are some exceptions to this, but I think for the most part, anyone who's being honest will say that constructive criticism stings, right? It's not something that we generally want to hear. What's interesting about it, though, as I'm thinking about it, is we make up so many stories about how other people are evaluating us, how they think about our work or who we are. And the beauty, so to speak, of constructive feedback is that it allows you to get a reality check to some extent on what that is, right? So in the process of getting that constructive feedback, you're also getting a lot of positive feedback, and you know exactly where the opportunity lies to, like you said, step it up, right? Whereas if we didn't get that feedback, we may make all kinds of assumptions about all of the things that we're not doing well enough. At least that gives us some focus and the ability to take very deliberate action.
Yes. And, something that you just said, which I think is very interesting, that I always consistently have to say to myself, and it has to do definitely with this imposter syndrome piece, is that I have to say to myself, the story I'm telling myself is, and I might say it to my students as well, the story you're telling yourself is blah, 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 or what is the story? So the story I'm telling myself when my professor says to me, you really need to step it up. Could be one of two things. It could be, the story I could tell myself would be, you don't know anything and you're dumb and you're not going to get this. And, everybody else knows it. Or the story I have to tell myself in order to continue to be resilient and participate and not quit. The story I have to tell myself is, okay, this is you do not know this and you need to know this. So you are going to need to do whatever it takes to learn this. And I think it's a really powerful way to look at things. Otherwise, the stories I tell myself could leave me just sort of under the blankets, never coming out.
You and me both. And I absolutely love that frame. And I think about that too, that the idea of the story I'm telling myself is so powerful, because it really does allow for the possibility that it is a story, right? That it is one interpretation and not fact. And I think if we do not create some distance between ourselves and what we tell ourselves, we don't have the ability to challenge them or to look at them through a different lens, right? So I love that you're doing that for yourself, and that you're also encouraging your students to do the same, because that story as a story could look very different, right? If we reinterpret it, what's another possible story?
Yeah. And I think, the other thing, like I've learned over time, and it's taken a long time that, and certainly it comes with a certain amount of tragedy or difficulty, that my feelings about things I think the power of feelings is enormous. And I think that feelings are really valid, and I want to be able to feel them. But I know personally for me that my feelings are not truths. And I always, that again is part of the story I have to continue to tell myself. Just because I feel stupid doesn't mean I am stupid. Just because I feel unprepared doesn't mean I am unprepared. So the feelings give me sometimes something to process and kind of dig at and think about while I'm feeling it. But if I act on those feelings, again, I'm back under the blankets and I'm covering my head.
Just being able to say that is so powerful, because I think so many of us don't reflect in that way. And you mentioned mindfulness earlier, which I think is a big piece of this, right? It's just the ability to recognize those are feelings and not reality. That's got to be a huge advantage.
Yeah, I think it's a learned advantage again over time. Cause like I said, it's, I don't think I've tackled every situation being able to walk and talk kind of thinking this way. I've had to really get to this point, like with a little bit of self-work and reflection. And I had to really get to the point, this is probably a little off topic, but I had to understand what my triggers are in things, like what triggers my feelings to just shoot through the roof. And if an occasion would arise that triggers my feelings, I really have to pull it back together, or else, again, it's either under the blankets or, running to hide. And an example of that is one of my particular triggers is being misunderstood. So if I am, trying to explain to my professor a certain way of thinking, and he is not grasping what it is that I am saying, and I feel misunderstood, in those minutes, I will shut down and not ask any more questions. And I have to really kind of rein that in quickly, or else I will lose the whole time that I have with him to learn.
Is there one particular strategy or approach that you have found to be able to catch yourself and pull it back in again?
It is a sense of what I'm feeling, right? So if I am starting to feel anxious or panicked or angry or frustrated, those feelings are usually my calling card to say, you're feeling something. So what's that about? And I have to mentally take a moment to step back and really look at why am I feeling like this? What is it? And usually it's about me. It's usually not about the other person. They may have said whatever, but it's usually something in my history or my past that has made me feel this yucky feeling. And if I can figure out what's made the yucky thing, if I can say to myself, oh yeah, that's misunderstood. There it is. It's cropping up again for you, sort of harness it in. And, I have a couple more that are specific to me. I have 3. I have misunderstood, or being a burden, or feeling abandoned. Those are the weird ones. If any of those trigger myself, then I have to really pull it back together in order to continue to learn.
I love that awareness. I think that is so powerful and something that everybody would benefit from better understanding. I talk about that a lot too, in terms of recognizing your triggers. I think the fact that you know contextually what those are, and also how to identify the physical symptoms that come along with them, right? That
Yeah.
I can feel it coming, right?
Yeah, it's terrible. It feels it feels terrible. And those 3 show up, interestingly enough, they all show up in every walk of life. So they show up in my teaching life, they show up in my personal life, they show up in my professional life. I had a conversation with my teenage son the other day. We've been arguing a fair amount, and I was able to say to him, why I'm so red-faced about this? Because in this, I feel misunderstood. You're not interpreting what I'm saying. And abandoned, which is silly because it's your son, but he's growing, he's leaving, he's changing. And in those things, when I start to feel that yuckiness, I can really pull it back to those couple of things like, yep, there they are. I can't do much about them in the moment. Like I'm still emotional, but I have to kind of use that mind over matter to be like, oh yeah, yep, It's that.
Yeah. And so you kind of answered a question I was about to ask, and maybe it's different when you're talking to your son, but do you say it out loud? Do you find it helpful to tell the other person what's going on?
I absolutely do. And I think it's one of those, it makes me weird, right? To people, it makes me weird to them, or it would make me weird to my partner to say, like, listen, I want you to know right up front, or to my children, these are my things. Like, it doesn't matter. These are always going to be my things. I'm not going to win over these three feelings, right? But I can be aware of them. So if, it gives me a little bit more power to pull myself back together. If I can say to my son later, yeah, I yelled at you, I'm sorry. And it was these things. Here they are. Like, they're showing up this way, like they boil down to those things. They show up in a manner, a bazillion different ways, as a student, as a teacher, as a colleague, as a partner, as a mom.
I know that I completely understand your saying it. I'm trying to think of the right way to say it, but essentially you're calling it weird. Right? But I think it's so much more than that. It may initially be perceived as weird because we don't all do it, right? But I think there's also something really powerful and about that vulnerability, right? And so not only does it allow people to better understand you, because there is so much miscommunication between people when we don't share and we get inside our own heads and we make up stories, but it also sets an example for other people. It gives other people permission to share too, which I think is really important as well, especially when you're talking about training students and helping people to think differently about their own experiences. Your willingness to model that is really powerful.
I think it's been helpful in raising children, and I try not to be too maternal with my students, although, my children are almost the same ages of my students. So sometimes I do feel like a little momish, but I will often say to my students when they head into the clinic, and this is not a favorite comment that I make that my colleagues really love, because many of my colleagues are very positive minded, and so the example I'm going to give you is that I will ask my students before they go into their clinical experiences, tell me 3 things that you think that you could possibly do to sabotage your relationship with your clinical instructor. So this will be the person, that will be teaching them in the clinic how to treat patients. And so, and I give them the examples. I give them mine, I give them, I hate to be a burden. And so if I do not want to be a burden, I am not going to ask people questions. And I will hide instead of asking questions, or I will not want to look stupid. And so therefore I don't want to burden somebody else with, me badgering them about the things that I don't know. So I give them that example. Some of my colleagues really want the students to go into the clinic thinking about their 3 strengths. But I already know their strengths, and they know their strengths too. I think that part of the sneakiness is that they don't know the thing that's going to set them off.
Wow. I love that so much. I think that's such an important lesson from just this conversation that you and I are having today. If everybody listening were to take one thing away from it, I would imagine that is a really powerful one of what are those triggers?
Yeah. Because if you know them, then you can do something with them. If you don't know them, then your feelings are just so, you're so heightened. Your threshold is, that much lower, where you can just be like sent over the moon. I have some really wonderful students who have come back and said, I don't think my clinical instructor likes me. And I'd say, tell me more, about that. What do you mean they don't like you? Well, they answered in this way, or they answered in this tone, or they answered in whatever, and to pull that apart, like that the person comes away feeling like I'm not liked, then they don't want to ask more questions, so we have to really look at what the other person is probably experiencing, or what that clinical instructor could have been experiencing in those moments, as to why a statement could have been, harsh or flippant. Nothing gives me more pleasure than for my student at the end of their clinical experience to say, oh, I thought my clinical instructor didn't like me in the first 3 weeks, but by the end we were really tight. We were able to communicate. We had a good experience.
Wow. This has been it's been so great talking with you. I have no doubt that people are going to take a lot out of this conversation. As we wrap up, I'd love to ask you, what motivated you to want to tell your story today?
Well, truthfully, I came across your question on the Givitas platform. And I'm really looking at trying to start a reciprocity ring with the students that I have that are graduating and going out into the field, because I think it's really important that they put out the things that they need and that they want, and it gives other people an opportunity to contribute and give. So you had a question about imposter syndrome, and I definitely had suffered from it, and I thought maybe it might be a little bit helpful, and hopefully it was.
It was tremendously helpful, Tara. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening today. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share it with other women who can benefit from this conversation. Before we go, I want to share some additional resources with you. If you struggle with imposter syndrome and you want to manage it more effectively, I invite you to join my free Imposter Syndrome online challenge. Every day for 7 days, you'll get an email with self-reflection questions and exercises to help you better understand your own experience with imposter syndrome and how to navigate it more effectively. To join the free challenge, visit executivekareersuccess.com/imposter-syndrome-challenge. When you sign up, you'll immediately receive your first message. Also, if you're interested in joining a community of women who engage in candid conversations that generally aren't happening elsewhere, I invite you to join my Leading Women discussion group. On the first and third Thursday of every month at 12 p.m. Eastern, we meet virtually over Zoom to talk about questions or challenges related to career management, leadership development, and any other relevant topics such as imposter syndrome and confidence. It's always a great discussion with a great group of women. If you want to check it out, you're welcome to be my guest on a future call. Just reach out to me at kim@executivekareersuccess.com, and I will share the call details with you. And if you want to join my newsletter to receive tips, insights, and updates, text Leading Women, all one word, to 66866. Finally, consider telling us your story. Contact me to learn more about how you can be a guest on the Impostor Syndrome Files. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day.